You called my mom obese and hideous? Laura didn't shout the words. She didn't stomp her feet or burst into tears. She spoke with the chilling, measured clarity of a judge delivering a verdict, asking a question she already knew the answer to, simply waiting for the man in front of her to confirm his own guilt. Right there, under the high glass ceilings of Center Mall, a 7-year-old girl in a bright blue dress stood her ground. Her hands were firmly on her hips, her round glasses catching the light as she stared directly into the eyes of Heo Sang Kyu, the man the city whispered about in dark corners, the man whose bespoke charcoal suit cost more than most people's homes. He was flanked by shadows, 2 towering men in black suits who looked ready to move at a moment's notice. But Laura didn't look at them. She wasn't scared. In fact, she looked like she was the one in charge. Around them, the hum of the mall died a sudden, violent death. Luxury shoppers froze. The clacking of designer heels on marble stopped mid-stride. Everyone saw the same impossible image, a small girl with colorful beads in her hair, looking up at a man who could ruin careers with a flick of his luxury watch. Heo Sang Kyu looked down at her, his expression a mask of serious, composed authority. He leaned in slightly, the way a predator might look at a bird that forgot to fly away. "Go back to your mother, little girl," he said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. Laura didn't move. She didn't even blink. "I will," she replied, her voice echoing in the silent atrium. "Right after you apologize." One of the bodyguards cleared his throat nervously. The other adjusted his tie, suddenly captivated by the design of the floor tiles. They knew what the crowd was just beginning to realize. Something historic was happening. A child was putting the bespoke boss on trial in his own kingdom. And looking at the fire behind Laura's glasses, she looked absolutely certain that she was the one who held all the power. The doors of the Center Mall atrium didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. It was 3 in the afternoon, the peak of the Seoul elite's shopping hour, yet the temperature in the marble-clad hall felt as though it had dropped 10 degrees the moment Heo Sang Kyu stepped inside. He moved with a terrifyingly smooth grace, his charcoal gray 3-piece suit catching the midday sun filtering through the glass ceiling, shimmering like the skin of a shark. The reaction was instantaneous. A group of teenagers laughing near the fountain fell silent, their phones slowly lowering as they took in the man whose face they had only seen in blurred news reports or heard about in hushed, frightened whispers. The crowd didn't just move, it parted like the Red Sea. Shoppers carrying bags from boutiques that cost a year's salary scrambled toward the storefronts, pressing themselves against the glass displays of watches and jewelry just to stay out of his path. They looked at the floor, at their phones, at anything other than the man walking toward the center of the atrium. Sang Kyu didn't glance at them. He didn't have to. The bespoke boss walked with the absolute, bone-deep certainty of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. Behind him, 2 men in identical black suits moved in perfect synchronization, their eyes scanning the balconies and the escalators with a predatory alertness that made the security guards in the mall look like children playing dress-up. To Sang Kyu, the mall wasn't a place of commerce, it was a shortcut. He checked his luxury watch, a masterpiece of platinum and precision, his face a mask of serious, undisturbed authority. He was a man of schedules and power, a man who had spent a lifetime making sure that nothing ever stood in his way. As he reached the center of the atrium, the silence was so heavy it felt physical, broken only by the rhythmic, authoritative click of his handmade Italian leather shoes against the polished stone. He was halfway across the floor when his pace slowed, a microscopic flash of irritation crossing his brow. There, near the grand staircase, a woman was struggling with a heavy shopping bag, her back to him as she tried to adjust her scarf. She was a moment too slow, an obstacle in a world that usually moved at his command. Sang Kyu didn't stop. He didn't swerve. He simply let out a sharp, cold scoff as he brushed past, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Obese and hideous," he muttered, his tone dripping with the casual cruelty of a king stepping over a beggar. "Move your bulk out of my sight." The woman froze, her face turning a deep, humiliated red. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her to vanish in shame. But before the echo of his insult could even die out, a small, firm hand reached out and caught the edge of his charcoal sleeve. It was a touch so light, yet so deliberate, that it stopped the most dangerous man in Seoul dead in his tracks. Heo Sang Kyu turned slowly, his eyes cold enough to freeze blood, only to find himself looking down. Way down, into a pair of round glasses and eyes that held absolutely no fear. The impact of the collision was slight, a mere brush of fabric against fabric, but the reaction it triggered was seismic. Laura's mother, mid-turn with her heavy bags, stumbled back an inch, her breath hitching as she realized whose path she had inadvertently crossed. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. The sudden, vacuum-like silence of the atrium told her everything. She stood paralyzed, her fingers white-knuckled around the handles of her shopping bags, her gaze fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. Heo Sang Kyu stopped. He didn't look at her with anger, he looked at her with a profound, clinical disgust, as if she were a smudge on a masterpiece. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal sleeve, his luxury watch catching the light with a cold, rhythmic flash. The mall shoppers who had been watching from the balconies quickly turned their heads, suddenly fascinated by store displays or their own empty hands. Nobody wanted to be a witness to whatever came next. "The air in this mall is expensive," Sang Kyu said, his voice not rising above a conversational silk, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the atrium. "It is a waste to have it consumed by someone so obese and hideous." The words weren't just an insult, they were a social execution. Laura's mother flinched as if she had been struck. The color drained from her face, replaced by a burning, deep-seated shame that made her want to sink through the floor. She was a woman who had worked hard to give her daughter a good life, but in this temple of glass and gold, under the judgment of a man like Heo Sang Kyu, she felt reduced to nothing. She stood frozen, the heavy bags pulling at her shoulders, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall in front of her child. The bodyguards behind Sang Kyu remained like statues, their faces impassive, though the younger one's eyes flickered with a momentary, buried discomfort. They expected the woman to mutter a frantic apology and scurry away into the shadows of the food court. That was the script. That was how the world worked when Sang Kyu spoke. But the script was about to be torn apart. Laura R. Heard felt her mother's hand tremble, and in that moment, the 7-year-old's world narrowed down to a single point of righteous fire. She didn't look at her mother's shame, she looked at the man who had caused it. She stepped forward, the colorful beads in her hair clicking softly like a countdown. While the rest of the mall looked away, Laura looked up. She planted her feet in the center of the atrium, her blue dress a sharp, defiant contrast to the sea of gray and black. "You," she said, her voice small but impossibly steady. Heo Sang Kyu was already turning to leave, dismissive and bored, when the word caught him. He paused, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He looked down, his eyes meeting the magnifying lenses of Laura's round glasses. For the first time in a decade, someone had dared to interrupt his exit. The air in the atrium seemed to crystallize, turning brittle and cold. Heo Sang Kyu began to step forward, his polished shoes ready to resume their rhythmic, shark-like glide across the marble, but the path was no longer empty. Laura R. Heard moved with a sudden, sharp precision that caught the eyes of every lingering shopper. She stepped directly into the center of his trajectory, her small frame a vibrant splash of blue against the sterile, monochromatic luxury of the mall. As she planted her feet, the colorful beads woven into her hair rattled with a distinct, musical click, a sound that, in the absolute vacuum of the mall's silence, echoed like the cocking of a weapon. She stood with her hands pressed firmly against her hips, her chin tilted upward at an angle that spoke of centuries of ancestral pride. She didn't look like a child playing hero, she looked like a sovereign nation declaring its borders. The bespoke boss came to a halt just inches from her. The physical contrast was absurd, a towering figure of organized crime in a charcoal suit that cost a fortune, looking down at a 7-year-old girl whose head barely reached his waist. Sang Kyu's eyes, usually as unreadable as black glass, flickered with a strange, microscopic twitch of his eyelid. He wasn't used to obstacles that didn't tremble. He wasn't used to being looked at through round glasses as if he were a specimen under a microscope. Behind him, the two bodyguards stopped so abruptly that their heavy coats flared. They shifted their weight, their hands twitching toward their sides, but they remained frozen. You couldn't shoot a child in a blue dress in front of 100 witnesses, but you also couldn't simply walk over her. Laura's mother reached out, her voice a terrified, paper-thin whisper. "Laura, please, come back here." Her hand hovered in the air, desperate to pull the girl back into the safety of the shadows, but Laura remained as unmovable as a mountain. The beads in her hair settled, the silence returning even heavier than before. Laura didn't look back at her mother. Her focus was absolute, pinned entirely on the man who had dared to use his tongue as a whip. She waited. She waited for him to realize that the space she occupied was no longer his to command. She waited for him to see that while he owned them all, she owned the truth. The tension in the atrium stretched to a breaking point, a silent tug-of-war between a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be told no and a little girl who refused to let him hear anything else. The two bodyguards, men whose lives were measured in split-second reactions and neutralized threats, stood paralyzed in the wake of the rattling beads. To their left and right, the expansive glass of the center mall reflected their own imposing figures, walls of muscle and dark fabric designed to intimidate the most ruthless elements of the Seoul underworld. They were trained to intercept knives, to read the twitch of a sniper's finger, and to stand between their boss and certain death. But as they stared down at Laura or Heard, their training offered no protocols. The younger guard, whose hand had reflexively twitched toward the concealed holster beneath his arm, suddenly found his fingers feeling heavy and useless. He looked at Laura, small, defiant, and vibrating with a moral authority he hadn't encountered in years, and then looked at the crowd. The mall was no longer a shopping center, it had become an amphitheater. Hundreds of eyes were pinned on them, and more importantly, hundreds of glowing smartphone screens were raised like tiny digital shields. A beads of sweat tension broke across the senior bodyguard's forehead. He was a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts without blinking, yet he found himself shifting his weight like an embarrassed schoolboy. His job was to protect Heo Sang Kyu from harm, but the threat standing before them didn't come from a weapon. It came from a 7-year-old girl with her hands on her hips, waiting for an apology. If he moved to push her aside, the video would be on every news cycle in the country within the hour, the most feared boss bullying a child. If he did nothing, the boss looked weak, stalled by a slip of a girl in a blue dress. It was a tactical nightmare with no violent solution. The senior guard glanced at Sang Kyu, searching for a command, but the boss remained unmoving, locked in a silent stare-down with the girl. The guard's gaze dropped to the floor, suddenly finding the intricate pattern of the marble tiles fascinating. He couldn't attack, he couldn't negotiate, and he certainly couldn't retreat. Beside him, the younger guard let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders dropping just a fraction. He looked at Laura's round glasses and then at the mother, who was still trembling in the background. For the first time in his career, he wasn't looking for a threat. He was looking for a way out of a situation where the only way to win was to lose. The two stern men, who were ready to face an army of assassins, had finally met the one person they were completely powerless to stop. Heo Sang Kyu tilted his head, his movement slow and deliberate, like a predator observing a strange new species of prey. He reached up, smoothing the lapel of his charcoal jacket with a hand that had signed death warrants and multi-million-dollar deals with the same cold indifference. The platinum of his watch glinted under the mall skylights, a blinding reminder of the world he occupied, a world where everything had a price and everyone had a master. "Do you have any idea who I am, little girl?" he asked. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, designed to make the knees of grown men buckle. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence was usually enough to suffocate any spark of rebellion. "I am the man who decides which shops stay open in this city. I am the man people pray they never meet in a place like this." Laura Heard didn't flinch. She didn't look at the expensive watch or the razor-sharp crease of his trousers. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze traveling through her round lenses with the piercing intensity of a diamond drill. The colorful beads in her hair shifted as she shook her head, a small, rhythmic sound of dismissal. "I don't care about your watch," she said, her voice clear and ringing through the silent atrium. "And I don't care how many shops you own. My teacher says that true importance isn't about what you wear or how many people follow you around in black suits." Sang Kyu's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through his mask of serious composure. "Is that so? And what does your teacher say importance is?" "It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you," Laura replied, her small hands tightening on her hips. "You saw my mom and you thought she was small, so you were mean. You used big words like obese because you think they make you sound smart, but they just make you sound like a bully. A man who is actually important wouldn't need to make a mother cry just to feel tall." The bespoke boss felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest, not fear, but a sudden, jarring realization. For decades, he had judged the world by the quality of its silk and the depth of its pockets. He had built a kingdom on the belief that power was the only currency that mattered. But as this 7-year-old girl stood before him, she wasn't looking at his power. She was looking at his soul, and she clearly found it lacking. "You're wearing a very nice suit," Laura added, her voice softening but losing none of its bite. "But it doesn't hide how ugly you were being. My mom is beautiful because she's kind. What are you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Heo Sang Kyu, the man who had an answer for every threat, found himself momentarily speechless, his bespoke armor pierced by a handful of plastic beads and a child's unwavering truth. The silence that had gripped the atrium was no longer empty. It began to hum with the soft, electronic clicks of modern witness. All around the perimeter of the confrontation, the shoppers who had previously been cowering behind storefronts began to reach into their pockets. One by one, sleek glass rectangles were raised. The glowing screens of hundreds of smartphones caught the overhead lights of Center Mall, creating a sea of artificial stars that circled the bespoke boss and the girl in the blue dress. Heo Sang Kyu felt the shift immediately. For a man of his stature, power was usually maintained through the absence of evidence, the things done in shadows, the whispers that never reached a courtroom. But here, under the unforgiving glare of 1,000 lenses, he was no longer an invisible force of nature. He was a character in a digital play being broadcast in real time. He could see his own reflection in the closest phones, a tall man in a charcoal suit being lectured by a child. He knew that with every passing second, the image was traveling through the fiber-optic veins of the city, stripping away the mystery that was his greatest weapon. The pressure began to transmute. It was no longer a matter of physical dominance or underworld politics, it was a crisis of public image. The murmurs from the balconies grew into a steady drone of collective indignation. The crowd, emboldened by the small girl's bravery and the safety of their recorded evidence, was no longer parting like the Red Sea. Instead, they were closing in, a tightening circle of digital eyes that demanded a resolution. Sang Kyu's senior bodyguard shifted closer, his eyes darting toward a teenager leaning over the railing with a tablet. "Sir," he whispered, his voice tight with an urgency that had nothing to do with security. "We're trending. Every major platform is picking up the live stream. The board of directors, the partners, they are watching this." The boss didn't move. He felt the sweat prickle at the back of his neck, not because he feared the law, but because he feared the one thing he couldn't kill, an idea. The idea that he was a bully. The idea that his bespoke elegance was just a thin veneer over a core of cowardice. The cameras were capturing more than just his face, they were capturing his hesitation. Every moment he stood there without apologizing, the narrative grew, the most feared man in Seoul was losing a fight to a girl with colorful beads in her hair. The social gravity of the mall had flipped, and for the first time in his life, Heo Sang Kyu was the one being crowded out. Heo Sang Kyu looked down at the small girl, his face a hardened mask of charcoal and shadow, but Laura did not retreat. The sea of glowing phone screens pressed closer, a digital jury waiting for her next move. She took a single step toward him, the colorful beads in her hair clicking with the finality of a closing door. You used a big word, Laura said, her voice cutting through the hum of the mall with a sharp, analytical clarity. You said my mom was hideous. But I don't think you know what that word means. My mom stayed up all night when I had a fever. She works 2 jobs so I can have these glasses to see the world clearly. When someone is sad, she's the first person to hold their hand. That is what I see. She paused, her round glasses catching the overhead light, making her eyes look twice as large and twice as honest. She gestured toward his immaculate charcoal suit, his polished shoes, and the platinum watch that cost more than a year of her mother's wages. You look like a prince from a storybook, she continued, her tone shifting from curiosity to a quiet, devastating pity. But stories say that the monster is usually the one who is handsome on the outside and rotten on the inside. You walked into this beautiful place and the first thing you did was try to make someone feel small just because you thought you could. You used your voice to hurt a stranger who didn't do anything to you. In my school, that's not called being important. It's called being a coward. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the oxygen right out of the atrium. Sang Kyu's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple, but Laura wasn't finished. Hideous isn't the shape of someone's body, she said, her hands returning to her hips in that final, defiant stance. Hideous is a heart that thinks it's better than everyone else. Hideous is a man who thinks his suit makes him a king while he acts like a bully. My mom is beautiful because her heart is full. But you? Even with all your money and your men in black suits, you're the only hideous thing in this mall right now. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted by the truth of a 7-year-old's sermon. Sang Kyu looked at the woman he had insulted, she was no longer looking at the floor. She was looking at her daughter, her shoulders beginning to straighten, her eyes clearing of shame. The boss looked back at Laura, and for the first time in his life, the most feared man in Seoul felt exposed, as if his expensive armor had been stripped away, leaving him standing naked in the light of a child's unwavering gaze. The silence that followed Laura's words was not merely a lack of sound, it was a physical weight that pressed down on the hundreds of people gathered in the atrium. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of 1,000 held breaths. Heo Sang Kyu stood motionless, his shadow stretching long and dark over the girl in the blue dress. He towered over her, a monolith of charcoal wool and tempered steel, his hands slowly unclenching at his sides. The senior bodyguard took a half-step forward, his eyes darting to the boss's face, looking for the familiar twitch of the jaw that usually preceded a violent outburst. In the underworld, men had been permanently silenced for far less than what this child had just said. The air grew electric with the possibility of a catastrophe. If Sang Kyu lashed out now, the cameras would capture the fall of an empire. If he remained silent, the silence would be his confession. 1 second passed. Sang Kyu looked down at Laura, his expression unreadable. He saw the way she didn't blink, the way her round glasses sat perfectly straight on her nose, and the way her colorful beads remained still, no longer rattling because she was no longer moving. She was a statue of pure, unadulterated conviction. For the first time in his life, the man who owned the city found himself in a space where his money was paper and his reputation was a ghost. He looked at her mother, the woman he had called hideous, and saw her standing tall, her hand resting on Laura's shoulder, no longer shaking. 2 seconds passed. A teenager on the second-floor balcony accidentally dropped their phone, and the sound of the device hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. No one moved. No one looked away. Sang Kyu's gaze shifted to the sea of glowing screens surrounding him. He saw himself as they saw him, a giant being measured by a child and found wanting. The bespoke boss felt the thin veneer of his dignity beginning to crack. He was a man who prided himself on precision, and he realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that he had made a profound tactical error. He had attacked the only thing in the mall that was more durable than his power, the truth. 3 seconds passed. The tension reached its absolute zenith, a shimmering wire stretched to the point of snapping. Sang Kyu's eyes moved back to Laura. He saw the fire in her gaze. Not the fire of hate, but the fire of a teacher waiting for a student to finally get the answer right. Slowly, the rigid line of his shoulders began to soften. The mask of serious, composed authority didn't break, but it shifted, revealing something beneath the charcoal suit that no one in Seoul had seen in years. He took a deep, audible breath, and the mall held its collective breath with him. The most feared man in the city began to lean down, not to intimidate, but to meet the girl at her own level. The silence in the center mall atrium reached its breaking point as Heo Sang Kyu, the man who never bowed, slowly lowered himself until he was eye level with the 7-year-old girl. His bespoke charcoal trousers creased as his knee touched the cold marble, a gesture of submission so profound that a collective gasp rippled through the balconies like a physical wave. The bodyguards stood like statues, their faces pale, watching the impossible unfold in high definition on 1,000 smartphone screens. "You are right," Sang Kyu said, his voice no longer a sharp blade, but a quiet, somber admission that carried through the hushed air. He didn't look at the cameras or the crowd, he looked only at Laura, seeing his own reflection in her round glasses. A man who uses his words to make others small is not a man at all. He turned his gaze toward Laura's mother. The woman stood frozen, her shopping bag still clutched in her hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. Sang Kyu bowed his head, a deep, formal apology that recognized her dignity in front of the entire city. "I was cruel, and I was wrong. Please, accept my deepest apologies for my ignorance." The atrium remained silent for a heartbeat longer, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, the tension snapped. Laura R. Heard reached out and patted the shoulder of his expensive suit, her colorful beads clicking softly. "Apology accepted," she said with a final, satisfied nod. "See? Manners aren't that hard, even for a boss." Sang Kyu rose to his feet, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, a look not of power, but of a man who had just been set free from the burden of his own ego. He adjusted his luxury watch, turned on his heel, and walked toward the exit. This time, the crowd didn't part in fear, they moved in a silent, respectful tribute to the man who had finally learned the definition of strength. As the bespoke boss disappeared into the evening light of Seoul, the mall erupted into a deafening roar of applause. People didn't rush to buy watches or designer bags, they rushed toward the little girl in the blue dress. But Laura was already walking away, holding her mother's hand, her head held high. That day, the legend of the girl with the beads was born, a story that would be told for years in every corner of the city, reminding everyone that while a suit can be bought, honor must be earned, and sometimes, it takes a child to show the most powerful man in the world how to truly stand tall.